Unnecessary death, lying down for it, I am steady. The waters are upside down, where did it go? Gravity, I am steady. Unnecessary death, lying down for it, I am steady. The waters are upside down, where did it go? Gravity, I am steady.
Hello and welcome to Devlog number 26. Ideally, I'd like to be doing one of these about every month or so, but I didn't get to do one for September because I spent about half that month moving from one side of the country to the other, so that obviously consumed a lot of my time. Combine that with the fact that I was splitting that limited time between 3 threads, which is minor updates, the second faction OSP, and the start of Conquest, I didn't really have a lot of time to get enough together to really show in a devlog. But now here we are at the end of October, right before Halloween, and I've got quite a bit to show for both the OSP and the first look at Conquest, which will be at the end of the video, so be sure to stick around for that. I do want to caveat that everything you're going to see in this devlog is extremely work in progress, so please keep that in mind. Generally, I try to show things off when they're in a relatively polished, almost finished state and then talk about the process that it took to get there, but I know that people really want to see the work in progress for the OSP particularly, and so we're going to show that off here. So without further ado, the OSP as a faction presents some interesting challenges for us in terms of the differences between how we develop the Alliance, where we're doing the entire faction at once, contrasted with the way that we did the Alliance, where we made the frigate first, and that was basically the only ship in the game for almost a year before we got the next hull and really started to build up what their roster looked like. But with a game that has a relatively large number of players now playing in comparison to our pre-early access period, we can't just trickle out individual hulls and build the faction up piecemeal, or else no one would really be playing it until it was done. So in order to actually build out the faction, we're doing it in passes, where we do the blockout for everything first, start doing rigging, meanwhile Stefmo is going to start working on final geometry, get that all in the game, then do texturing and colliders and such, going through the entire faction basically in a scanline pattern, essentially. The only hull that this didn't apply to was the Othello class, and the reason for that was that it is the most similar to everything that we've already done in terms of a traditional warship, so it was very easy to just push that from concept to final art. The upside to this, and the reason that we're able to do it this way in the first place, is that because the OSP is mostly comprised of civilian ships, we can actually start testing the ships before we have the final art done, because as our modders know, much to their chagrin, our texturing and damage model are very closely related, so you actually can't test hulls until you have a full UV done. But because the OSP ships essentially don't have armor because they're all civilian ships, there's no reason to actually need to push to final textures in order to start testing. So first up, we've got the Othello class, and for those of you, I know there was a lot of confusion on how it's spelled. It's Ocello, by the way. It's a command cruiser. Basically, its role, as I've said before, is to be the OSP's kind of centerpiece of the fleet, the only ship that they have that can really go toe-to-toe with a true warship. It's got a unique feature built into it, which allows it to use both OSP and Alliance equipment, and it's the only ship in the faction that's able to do that. And so as you can see here, when I click on a mount, we've got the list of all the available Alliance weapons, as well as a couple of the new OSP weapons that we're still in the process of adding. The reasoning for this is that the lore behind this ship is that there's a bunch of these mothballed Othello class cruisers that are just sitting, basically waiting to be reactivated. They still have some Alliance equipment on them, but some of it still needs to be replaced, and so it makes sense that they'd be able to access whatever equipment was left on these ships. I also think it helps a little bit with the visuals of the ship, because it's clearly designed to be an Alliance warship, and having a bunch of tacked-on hodgepodge OSP equipment would kind of look weird in many circumstances. In terms of its slot layout, it's kind of a lighter version of the Axford, so it's got 2 Class 4s up on top and 1 Class 4 on the bottom, whereas the Axford has that Class 5 on the bottom. It's also got a set of 4 Class 2 mounts, 2 on the back, 1 on the top and 1 on the bottom, and then 1 on each side. And then it's also got 4 Class 1 PD mounts, 1 on the superstructure, 1 on the front nose, and then 2 on the sides. And then on the inside, it's got a fair smattering of compartments and modules. Now, this ship is totally done. We could release this into the game right now and it would be perfectly playable, but as I said, we're going to release the whole faction at once, so sorry. But it is one less thing on our plate. Now, moving on to the actual unique part of the OSP, we've got the first of the line ships, which is the bulk carriers. So basically, these are designed to be cargo ships that are carrying large amounts of not easily containerizable cargo, so dry cargoes such as raw materials, sand, ore, that kind of stuff. And in their pressed role as a warship, what they are is kind of your mainstay gunboats. We put a lot of onus on ourselves to make the OSP tell the lore of the OSP through the appearance of its ships. We could have just made a couple cargo ship models, but we really wanted to make it so that every single one of them was unique, because in the real world there's so many different variations in cargo ships. It would only make sense that in this fictional space world that a cargo ship is not just this mass-produced hull. They're designed to order by the companies that are using them, and so they all kind of have their own unique twist. One of the things people were concerned about, both in the Discord and the comments in Devlog 25, was that there would be objectively better layouts and that people would be ship scumming, which is something I joked about in the Devlog, in order to make it so that they get the hull layouts that they want. But the cool thing about the way that I've rigged and implemented this is that all of these ships are functionally the same. They all have the same number of external mounts with roughly the same kind of traversal arc coverage, and they all have the same socket keys that represent all the different parts, so you can actually duplicate one of these ships and you get a new ship that has the exact same equipment installed on it in roughly the same places. Now obviously the nature of Nebulous means that certain layouts do have slight advantages over others. A superstructure that's up forward means that your rotating radar might be exposed to enemy fire a little bit more, or one of those sterns that has less engines means you have less engine redundancy, but I think that these things are really minor and will only affect people who really want to min-max their ships. And frankly, if you're trying to min-max your ships, then a hodgepodge collection of freighters is probably not the faction you should be playing in the first place. In terms of the status of these ships, the bulk carriers are final geometry done. Stefmo's moving on now to doing colliders, LODs, and textures, which are the final thing that we do because, as I said, the damage model and the textures are very intertwined, so we want to make sure that the hulls are good to go before we actually do all that work. Once we get these into game, the eagle-eyed of you will notice that the layouts have actually changed from what you saw in the fleet editor. The reason for that is that the layouts are not persistent right now, but that's coming very soon. I could double down on the uniqueness of the OSP and make it so that I give you a random layout every time you go into battle as the final product, which is what happens right now, but I don't want to do that because we need to make sure that they stay consistent for when we get to Conquest and that the ships are actually staying the same between the battles, because that's kind of the whole point of Conquest. Now, moving on to the OSP weapons a little bit, I swear I've confirmed this before, but people in the Discord are always saying, we're not really sure if the OSP is getting their own weapons, but yes, they are. There are going to be OSP faction unique weapons, and this is the first one we'll go over, which is the, as we're calling it, the Big Defender. It's basically a double-barrel defender. It's kind of the OSP making up for its lack of really accurate sensor technology compared to the Alliance by just doubling down and filling space with more lead to try to hit missile targets. And again, kind of trying to tell the OSP's story through the way that things look. The casing is made to look like it's just welded together from a box when they needed it in basically an assembly line in a shipyard while they're trying to refit all these ships. And I think some of our modders will also be happy to have this change because it's kind of an improvement on the continuous weapon components, in that what we have here is two muzzles that are able to fire simultaneously on a continuous weapon, which they can't do on the main branch currently, so that'll enable modders to have things like multiple beam weapons going at the same time. And by the way, these weapons are not UV'd and textured yet, so please pay no attention to how ugly the texturing appears. But next up, we've got one of the OSP's custom-made anti-ship turrets, so this is a Class 4. There's also a smaller Class 2 variant of it. It's a 100mm cannon that's meant to fire AP and HE rounds at a pretty high rate of fire, so the OSP's weapons focus pretty heavily on high alpha, high rate of fire, but slow reload, because it's kind of meant to be an ambush faction. You sneak up on the enemy, or you come around a rock, lay as much fire as possible, and then try to get out as quickly as possible. And because of that, these weapons have huge auto-loaders, so they'll be able to fire continuously for about 30 seconds before they have to start reloading. But when they do have to start reloading, you're going to be pretty vulnerable because it does take quite a while. And then as the last weapon that we'll show off for this particular devlog, we've got a first of all time for Nebulous, which is a turreted missile launcher. Although it's actually more of a dumbfire rocket launcher, it's modeled after an MLRS, so basically it allows you to have a bunch of size 1 rockets that are pretty long and have a bit of explosive power, although they don't have any kind of seeker on them, so really you're just firing slow, explosive projectiles that point defenses can take out. These dumbfire rockets are subject to the same pooling mechanics that normal missiles are, so you'll just need to select your target, select the number of missiles you want to fire, and then the turrets will take care of allocating which turrets need to fire which rockets. This missile launcher was actually the hardest thing to get working in the OSP so far. The missile infrastructure is just really not designed to support this kind of weapon, but I was able to get it to work after a whole week of just banging my head against it. But people have been asking for turreted missile launchers for a really long time. It doesn't really fit with the Alliance's paradigm, but it does fit with the OSP, so now we have it. And I know it's going to make a lot of modders happy because they've been asking for the infrastructure to be able to make this for a long time, and now they can get their RIM 116 launchers in and be happy. The other really hard thing to do for the OSP was making sure that the damage control boards actually looked like what the modular ships look like. So as I click on each of these ships, you'll notice that the status display and the DC board actually do change to look like what the ship actually looks like. That red line is going to go away. Right now it's just there for me to make sure that everything's aligned correctly. I did make a couple attempts at trying to get the orange lines to point to where the components actually are, but there really just isn't a lot of space for it where I can guarantee that things are going to fit together the way that they're supposed to with all the different possible lengths of the ships. So I think for now things are going to have to be outlaid around the outside of the ship the way they are here, but maybe in the future it's subject to experimentation. Now onto our second type of line ship, which is the container freighter. These are kind of the polar opposite of the bulk freighters, where instead of carrying large quantities of just loose cargo, they're carrying containerized consumer goods, but also in terms of their use in the OSP fleet. Whereas the bulk freighters are your general purpose gunboats, you can put basically whatever you want on them, they're really flexible. The container freighters are much more purpose-built for carrying, well, you'll see in a second. You'll notice that we've got these two very large sockets on the top and two very large sockets on the bottom. They're not really analogous to anything that's currently in the game. They're, in terms of size, kind of a class like 15 or 20 socket. And they can fit this very unique module called the Container Bank Launcher. You'll also notice that these components actually descend down into the hull, so that's a new functionality where we have these special pads on certain sockets that allow you to mount things on the surface, but that pad can be removed if there are things that need to go into the hull. Now, when we were brainstorming for the OSP, I kind of thought to myself and posed to the other devs, what's the scrappiest, weirdest, most insane, most hodgepodge together space navy thing that you can think of? And the answer is obviously shipping container missiles. The OSP will be getting access to the conventional non-hybrid missiles that the Alliance has, the SGM-2 and the SGT-3, but they'll also get a special type of missile, which is the container missile. I think about half the people who are watching this right now are screaming because they think it's really cool, and the other half are screaming because they're really worried that it's just going to be really bad missile spam. But right now I'm not too concerned about it. I think it's a really unique facet for the OSP, and the container missiles are 4 times the size of a torpedo, so they're really big, really slow, really fat, easy to detect, and they have less health, so they're pretty easy to shoot down. So we'll see how the balance testing turns out, and we'll see what we have to do to tune them, but I don't think it's going to be too much of a spammy problem. And I think that the cool uniqueness that it adds to the faction is going to be worth the effort that it's going to take to do the balancing. That about covers it for the OSP progress so far. There's some additional weapons that we've got to implement, some broadside cannons that are going to require some additional programming, so I haven't gotten to those yet. And then some other unique weapons like a cannon that fires plasma ampules to melt the armor on larger warships, which is something that the OSP would need. And we've also got the clipper hulls that we haven't talked about yet, but that's because I haven't even started rigging them yet, but they'll be visible pretty soon. And finally, to close out this devlog, a first look at the prototype for the Conquest system map that I've been working on and off for the last month and a half. In some sense, this feels a lot to me like going all the way back to Devlog 1, where I'm showing off a really primitive gray box prototype, just implementing the basics of the ideas. And it's really intimidating to show stuff off when it's this early, but I know people are really excited for Conquest and they want to see what's going on behind the scenes, so here's your first glimpse at it. So this is the Akota system. It's a system that sits between Chiasmia and Crebensis in Alliance space, so you've got the 2 gates to that orbiting on the outside of the system. And we picked this system for a couple reasons. We wanted to save Crebensis and Bethel for the actual storyline campaign, and we didn't want to spoil what's going to be in there or get people familiar with the system to kind of give it more of a mysterious invasion feel. And also because in lore, Akota is a system controlled by multiple governments, so it makes sense that you'd be having the possibility of some kind of solar system level conflict in here. Right now, the solar system structure supports stars, and it can support multiple stars with planets orbiting them. Planets, moons, minor objects like asteroids, asteroid belts, although you can't actually go to the individual rocks in the asteroid belt, it's just these minor locations of interest, and then stations, gates, things like that, infrastructure. You can zoom in and out to different levels, which is actually a much harder problem than it sounds like. The hardest part of implementing this map is the variance in scale. So you can go all the way from zoomed out, looking at the entire solar system, down to zooming to an individual moon and then back out. And the time it takes to zoom from close in the solar system to all the way out is the same time it takes to zoom from the outside of a planet's sphere of dominance to one of its moons. And the way I accomplished that is with different, what I call zoom contexts. And that's a behind the scenes thing, but basically whenever you zoom in on an object, you're switching what context you're in. It helps deal with the difference in zoom levels. It helps deal with the floating point errors by resetting everything's origin and a couple other things. Here you can see the map also currently supports friendly units in space, not enemy units yet since I still haven't worked on that, but we've got one ship around Onyx the moon, and we've got 2 ships grouped into TF Linden. You can't tell there are 2 ships currently because there's no way to get that information, but that's coming in the future. One of the other problems with scale is that when you zoom out, the system looks pretty barren if you don't have some kind of context to show you what else is around the planets. And so there's 2 things that I do here to help with that. When you zoom out of a planet's sphere of dominance, all of its moons will be kind of pushed out on these strings so that you can see at a larger scale what the structure of the system is at the lower level. And I like this a lot more than just having all of the icons collapse into one. And then also you can see that we have 3 friendly ships around this planet because all of those of unique types have been grouped together underneath. So we've got 2 ships in that one task force, 1 ship around the moon that gets grouped into 3 friendly units underneath the name of the planet. And then as more types of objects such as stations and things like that are added, those will also be grouped underneath the name. So you can see at a glance what's where in the system. And all of these bodies are modeled on true Kepler orbits. So we have real elliptical orbits that all the planets and orbiting structures sit on, although they are in 2D instead of 3D. And when I advance the turn here, you can see that the world starts stepping forward 30 minutes at a time. That's why there's a little bit of a jerky motion. I've got to work on smoothing that out so I can smooth out the time step a little bit. But everything moves around the planets the way they should. And as we continue to zoom out, we can see that as the planets get pushed out onto those little sticks, that they're continuing to be animated. So this allows you to see the actual true position of all the moons, regardless of how far zoomed out you are. There's also a lot of work that's not visible here, such as the solar system's internal structure, how I'm storing all the ship locations and saving them in a database so that I can make sure that this is done right the first time and I don't need to redo it later. So that concludes the first preview of what Conquest looks like. I hope you liked it. If you haven't read the concept document, I urge you to check it out in our 1MC announcements channel, where it's got all of the mechanics that we want to have in the final game mode. We should be starting to call up testers for the OSP soon, so keep an ear out for that. And until next time, thank you for watching.